Hello friends, in today's video I am going to show you how I painted this beautiful misty mountain scene with birds and this beautiful landscape using watercolors. So first I'm going to start with my Arches watercolor paper, and I am going to get my paint ready. For all the materials, links are in the description below. But primarily I am going to use indigo, cadmium yellow, a little bit of turquoise, and a tiny little bit of pink. But I am just getting my paint and my brushes ready. Now, I practiced a little bit before doing this tutorial to get the washes right, to get the color combinations right. I was experimenting maybe with a moon or no moon. And after all of this, I sort of feel like I have a very easy hang of it, and I'm going to show you how I did it. So first, I am going to start by wetting my paper with clean water. So this is just the very first kind of wash. Well, it's only the background wash. So just wet the paper very evenly. So I want my paper to be shiny and a tiny little bit of puddles on the edges if at all possible. So it's not super puddly, but only a little bit, and it's very shimmery. When you hold it up to the light, it shines it on the paper, and this is exactly what you want. But it needs to have a little bit of puddles because the paint, when we put it in, it needs to be easy for the paint to travel. So I am going to start with a super light wash of turquoise, and I am going to start just with basically like horizontal moves, and this is a very simple wet on wet technique where we are putting wet paint on wet paper basically. So this first background layer, like our sky and our main wash, is going to take a little bit of patience and time. So I will speed up the process a little bit as I go through it, but in real time the first wash takes about 10 minutes. In all the trials that I did, it was taking about 10 minutes to have the patience to like move the paint around, to move the paper. I don't particularly like to do my washes with just brush strokes, to blend them with just the brush, because I just personally like the meditative technique of watching the paint flow in the paper. So that is what I have been using for many years. And if you guys have gotten a chance to take a look at my book, Watercolor for Relaxation, this is one of the techniques that I use in one of my tutorials, where you just watch the paint flow horizontally on the paper. You can do this vertically as well to create sort of a rainy landscape, but that is a different tutorial. So now I am going to add a little bit of cadmium yellow because I want to create a little bit of a sunset scene. So a little bit of yellow and orange and pink create a beautiful sunset look to my first wash, to like my sky wash. So again, this is a process where I just like move the paper around and let the paint flow. I like to watch this process, and I hope you enjoy it as well. Now, as the very last step for my sky background, I love to add a very high contrasty indigo and let it flow again on the paper to just create like a little bit of depth in the sky, and it flows really nicely and it creates this magical sunset with depth in it. Alright, so now that our first layer, our background layer, is completely dry, I am using a soft brush and I am going to start layering mountains. So the very tip of the brush has a very light value of indigo, so it's just a tiny little bit of paint with a lot of water. I like to dry my brush in when I diffuse my colors, because I don't want to add more water to it. More water to it is going to create blooms, is going to create a very like uncontrollable kind of effect, like you can't control water all that much. So I like to keep my brushes a little bit dry, like damp, and not super doused with water. So in this layer I just did a very thin layer of indigo, just a tiny little bit, and then I'm going to do another mountain for the very background layer. Now, as you can see, the first two mountains dried very lightly. So this is just something that watercolor does. It just dries really lightly. So I'm gonna go ahead and do another layer of mountain. This time a little bit more paint on my brush, just a tiny little bit on the tip. Again, I am cleaning my brush off of the water so I don't have like weird water effects in my mountains. So just a tiny little bit of indigo, and using the belly of the brush I am just dragging the paint down to create a diffusion layer, like the mountain is disappearing onto its on the bottom, onto the background. This creates a misty effect. So I just clean the paint off of my brush, dry it out a little bit so the brush is damp, and just drag the paint down with a damp brush. All right, so now the third layer of mountains. So again, this is a process that it is very repetitive, but it is very satisfying to see how the landscape starts coming together as you add more and more mountains in the foreground with a darker color. So we're only using indigo, and we are letting the wash of the background to come through on the underside of the mountains basically. So I am using the belly of my brush to drag that color down. So as I go more into more layers of mountains, I am adding more indigo and less water. All right, so again, you see that the mountain that it was a little bit darker before, it dried very lightly. So I am focusing on adding more and more indigo each time to create the effect of the background mountains are very, very light, and this creates the depth, like atmospheric perspective per se. Well, it really is. So again, I'm using the same brush, and I'm using the very tip of the brush to create my mountain outline, and then the tip of the brush to drag the color down. I am adding a little bit more water and to create that diffusion again, but with like a bit of a damp brush, not just add water, just kind of clean the brush, damp it a little bit, dry it so it's not just full of water, and then drag the color down. So now I want to tilt the paper downwards so the paint moves downwards. I'm trying really hard here to show you how the paint travels downwards, but I'm having a hard time trying to show you just how the paint just flows downwards when the paper is a little bit damp. And I'm just gonna let it dry on a vertical position, so as it dries, it just dries downwards. So now for the this is not the very last mountain, this is the second to last mountain. I am wetting the paper first, so I see that like my paint has a wetness to travel downwards too, or with, like it helps it travel downwards as I am placing it, as I'm putting it down, because the more layers you start putting on the paper starts becoming a little bit more water resistant. The paint doesn't flow as nicely as like the first layer, so I'm helping the paper flow, like helping the paint and the paper to flow a little bit nicely. So I'm just wetting it first and then adding a little bit of water and just helping it flow, so you can see that it's a little bit shimmery, and it's helping the paint flow a little bit better on the paper. So now, while this layer is getting dry, I am using a smaller brush with a very tiny point. So use either a smaller brush or a brush that has a small point to paint my birds. So to paint the birds, I am going to start with the very, very background birds. Remember that typically birds are in flocks, so I paint like 3 or 4 in a little space. And the very background ones are super light color, so they're almost like transparent. And as you keep moving forward, you add a little bit more paint. So I'm just gonna go through the painting and add birds as I go, and in little empty spaces at the bottom of the mountains. It's really nicely fills in a little bit of those spaces, and the more closer I am, the darker the bird will be. Alright, so now for the very last layer, I am using the same brush that I've been using, but I am using a high concentration of indigo. So I just cleaned my brush and I took the water off mostly, and now it's just almost pure indigo that I am doing the very mountain at the very front. So I am doing the main outline with this dark indigo, and I am going to, once I have my outline ready, I am going to add more details to the outline basically. So I just want to fill in the basic shape, and then I'm going to add a little bit of details because at the being the very front mountain, it has just a little bit more like an organic feel to the line. It's a little bit more jaggedy, a little bit more as if there were trees in the front and bushes and all that. So you can add as much in detail as you like, but that is at the very last step. I hope you guys enjoy this tutorial, and let me know in the comments below if you have any questions or suggestions on better techniques. I don't know, materials, if you guys have suggestions on other materials. But anyway, let me know in the comments what you think about this video, and if you have suggestions for more tutorials, I am all ears. Alright, I'll see you guys in the next video.